The Clash made their debut performance July 4th, 1976, the American Bicentennial. They'd be supporting the Sex Pistols at the Black Swan nightclub in Sheffield. The band's nickname for the club was the Mucky Duck. The Pistols were alternately seen as comrades in arms and rivals by the Clash. The new band was excited, so excited they left early in the morning to drive to Sheffield, even though it was only a 4-hour drive and their show wasn't until 8 p.m. The gig had been booked by Malcolm McLaurin, who told the club manager that the supporting act was the 101ers. There were 60 or 70 101ers fans there, and they were a bit disappointed. There were at least a half dozen there, though, who looked a bit punky. The Clash had all the gear in. It was pretty exciting. Joe was out of his suit and into jeans and shoes dripping with paint. There was everything to do, everything to change. They might have had the look down, but they were still extremely green. They threw themselves into fully inhabiting the punk personas they had evolved into. The day the Clash started, really, when we played the Mucky Duck, it was the first time I'd played on stage. The night before felt frightening, and once I got on stage I began mucking about, and the moment I got on stage I felt like I was in my living room, and Mick had come over to tune my guitar, but it didn't bother me. I just wanted to jump around, but Mick wanted to be in tune. Mickey Foote was doing sound that night, and he remembers an enthusiastic response, or at least a positive one. Bernie told the promoter the Clash would be the next big thing, and now, instead of just one punk band on the London scene, there were two. The Sex Pistols had company. The next night, the Ramones, the Stranglers, and the Flamin' Groovies had a show at Dingwalls. Members of the Clash and the Sex Pistols went to the show, along with Rat Scabies, Chrissie Hynde, and pretty much everyone else on the scene. You had to go see the Ramones. There was no choice. We went to see them at Dingwalls the following night, and everyone was there. I remember Paul Simonon fighting with J.J. Bernal, and Chrissie Hynde was there as well. According to Bernal, the fight broke out when Paul Simonon spat as J.J. Bernal walked past him. According to Paul Simonon, JJ kicked him, and that started the row. Paul Simonon was talking with Paul Cook and Steve Jones when he was punched by JJ Bernal. Drinks were spilled, and suddenly it was the three of them jumping on JJ Bernal, and they were all ejected from the club, and there was a face-off outside. The Stranglers and their biker friends versus Johnny Rotten, Chrissie Hynde, Paul Simonon, Steve Jones, and Paul Cook. The fight dissipated, but from then on, the Pistols and the Clash were tighter than ever, and the Stranglers were dead to them. The Ramones, however, were like punk gods. The Ramones' first self-titled album was one of the only records Paul Simonon even owned. The Clash had moved in together at Joe's place by this time, and they played that record incessantly. It can't be stressed how great the first Ramones album was to the scene. It gave everyone that couldn't play the idea that it was simple enough to play. We all used to practice along with it. Paul and I spent hours, days, weeks playing along to that record. Anyone could see where the notes went, and it gave everyone confidence. Throughout the summer of '76, the Clash bucked down at Rehearsal Rehearsals, writing and fine-tuning 14 songs and their performances of them. Some would be part of their debut album recorded the following spring. Janie Jones, London's Burning, Deny, What's My Name, 48 Hours, and 1977. Others would be set aside. I Know What to Think of You, How Can I Understand the Flies, Mark Me Absent, Deadly Serious, and Sitting at My Party. The Clash got their first press in Melody Maker, July 24, 1977. Carolyn Coon interviewed Mick Jones and Joe Strummer. We're challenging complacency, standing up for rock and roll. We want to get rid of rock and rollers like Rod Stewart, who kissed royalty after gigs. On August 13th, Bernie Rhodes organized a private show at Rehearsal Rehearsals for 10 members of the music press. The place was still a dump, but Bernie had the boys painting the place and cleaning it up for several days before the gig. Paul Simonon was the artist of the bunch, and after seeing Glenn Matlock's trousers with Jackson Pollock-style splatters, he had an idea. They started painting their clothes with splashes of color. Bernie had the guitars and gear spray-painted bright colors by the car detailers down the road. The Clash looked like no one else, except maybe Pollock himself. Despite the paint job, the place was still a dump. The wine Bernie bought for the press was cheap and terrible, and the seating was a dentist chair and an orange crate. But the Clash were tight, and they gave it everything they had like it was a real show. They were fucking brilliant. I'd listened for 2 months, but anybody who came down there would have been blown away. The three guitars sounded phenomenal. Each of them knew exactly what they wanted. Keith Levene had a Marshall with a preamp, Joe had a Telecaster going through a Vox. Mick tried lots of different setups. It was a sound designed for maximum impact. The press was also impressed, and in the music publication Sounds, Giovanni D'Adamo declared it was a tapestry of sound and color. and called the Clash the first band to come along who will really frighten the Sex Pistols. But now they had to live up to the current hype and build upon their reputation. They also needed to continue writing and developing new material. Bernie Rhodes was pushing them along actively, but not dictating what the content should be. His input was everything. He said to us, write about what you feel is important. He never told us to write about this or that. He just told us to write about what was happening. Don't write love songs. Their third gig was at Screen on the Green with Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks on August 29th. The Clash had to build the actual stage at 8 a.m., and they were required to poster for the event, and then they spent the day guarding their equipment from thieves and watching the outlaw Josie Wales 3 times in a row. Finally, the Clash went on at 1 a.m. They were exhausted, and they were really unhappy with their performance. Paul suspected that the Pistols or Malcolm sabotaged their sound as well. The morning after this late-night gig, Paul, Joe, and Bernie went to Carnival, a celebration of West Indian culture. Tensions were high in London. Unemployment was high, poverty and racism were rampant, and the West Indies cricket team had recently trounced England in an important match. Reactions to the win enhanced stark divisions between communities. The conflict at that day's festival would be a key moment in the Clash's formation and moral direction. People look back on it as a black and white riot. It wasn't. It was a wrong and right riot. It wasn't the black kids against the white police. It was youth at a black festival against the police. When a black youth was arrested for supposedly picking someone's pocket, tensions erupted. The police were ready and formed a line of riot police to square off against festival goers. Bricks were thrown at the cops. At least one by Paul Simonon. Joe Strummer tried unsuccessfully to light a car on fire. And Don Letts was famously captured in an iconic photo. He was standing with his dreads in front of a line of police. The photo was used for the cover of the Black Market Clash compilation. Paul and Joe were even confronted angrily by a group of black youths, but they were eventually let be. They'd been squatting, impoverished, pushed around by cops their whole lives, and witnessing racial injustice. This felt like a taking back of power in a way. To Joe Strummer, who had idealized the protests of the 1960s, it was exhilarating. He was finally in the thick of it. Terry, for his part, was mostly apolitical, and he really didn't romanticize this stuff. As a result, Bernie Rhodes mostly kept him behind the kit and away from the press, lest he ruin the band's growing political narrative. On September 5th, 1976, they played at the Roundhouse, just down the street from Rehearsal Rehearsals. The Clash were supporting Kersal Flyers and Crazy Cavan. This would turn out to be Keith Levene's last show with the Clash. Keith left the band after this gig because he couldn't be bothered to come to rehearsals. As I recall, he actually said, quote, "I can't be bothered to come to rehearsals." So Joe said, well, don't bother to come again. Paul Simonon was okay with this because he no longer had to share stage left with a guitarist. Keith says that he was fired unfairly, after his job kept him from a rehearsal that had not been scheduled. But the decision was made by Joe, Mick, and Paul. Without Bernie's knowledge or say-so, the band was taking a greater degree of control. Bernie Rhodes and Malcolm McLaurin organized a festival-style punk rock event at the 100 Club on September 20th and 21st, 1976. The show was the stuff of punk rock legends and spurred the birth of 2 key goth bands, SIOUXSIE and the Banshees and BAUHAUS. The performers list reads like a who's who of the scene. The first night featured the Sex Pistols and the Clash. 2 other bands were formed for the event, using players from the Sex Pistols orbit. SIOUXSIE and the Banshees with Sid Vicious on drums, and Subway Sect. A teen, Shane McGowan, who would later form the Pogues, was in the audience. Sid Vicious threw a pint glass into the crowd, injuring a woman and prompting his arrest. SIOUXSIE refused to remove her swastika armband, causing a conflict with Rhodes. Like other punks who flaunted offensive Nazi imagery, SIOUXSIE had no real affiliation with or sympathy for Nazis past or present. She was trying to rile up her parents' generation. It was the same F you mom and dad energy the London SS had flirted with but then abandoned. But it clearly angered Bernie Rhodes, and he refused to let her band perform in front of the Clash's pink stage backdrop. The Clash were tighter, faster, and harder than they'd been before. Paul was getting good, Keith was now gone. There was a technical problem, and Joe used a transistor radio broadcast about IRA terrorism and heavy delay to improvise a key moment in the set. David J. and Kevin Haskins were there. David credits this as the moment when he knew he wanted to form the band which would become Bauhaus.
We saw them really early on. That was like I think it was their third gig ever. And they were opening for the Pistols. We went to the 100 Club to see the Pistols. We didn't know who the support was. And we didn't know this band. They came on and blew us away. We recognized Mick Jones because we would go down to gigs before punk, like during the so-called pub rock era. And we go to pubs like the Nashville, the Hope and Anchor, places like that. And we'd always see this kid who was always dressed great, very sharp. We admired him, you know, his style. Then he had longer hair, like a feather cut, you know, like a Keith Richards circa 74. And he'd wear leather jackets, like women's clothes mixed in with like really cool, like rocker stuff. Anyway, we recognized the guitar player. It's like, oh, this is that kid. He's cut his hair short, but that's him. And they were just amazing, yeah. And then the Pistols came on, who were also incredible. I mean, that gig was changed everything. And we decided to form a band there and then, like a punk band, you know. Suddenly, the world was full of opportunity. And what we loved was that they were singing about their lives. The Clash and the Pistols were singing about being, you know, in your late teens, early 20s, in the mid 70s, in a pretty grim UK, and wanted to shake things up, change music for sure. You could write about your life, you know, so yeah, we can do this.
Was it a little club? Like, how many people were at that show?
Probably about 80.
Do you remember what any of the songs that were played were? Like, were these bands fully formed? Like, the Clash sound like the Clash?
Well, they did, yeah, it was raw. In that, it was very exciting. And they played, you know, some songs that ended up on that first album. Yeah. And at one point, there was something wrong with the PA. Joe got a little transistor radio out just to like cover while they fixed. The sound guy had the wherewithal to put echo, like a dub echo on the voice. And what came over, it was a live radio, it was a news broadcast about, it was about the IRA and a suspected bomb in London, something like that. So it was very zeitgeist. And then they got the sound up again, and the guitars was ready to go. It was this moment of just sort of like, yeah, zeitgeist. Like, this is like the white hot center of the world at the moment in music. Very exciting. I told Joe about that years later, and he remembered that incident as being something very special.
After this show, the Clash began headlining their own gigs and got some significant press attention in NME and Melody Maker. The punk scene was still small and centered around London, but the band was playing a bit further afield. October 16th, 1976, at the University of Central London, they played for an audience comprised entirely of rowdy, drunken 1950s-style Teddyboys, and they were in serious danger of being attacked and/or unplugged by the crowd. The Teddyboys detested their spiky hair and punk appearance, and young punks also thought violence was cool and exciting, so when the Clash did play with the Sex Pistols, Sid Vicious was, well, vicious and ready to jump into the crowd and start violence at the drop of a hat. Once Paul and Joe jumped in to back him up. Mick was a little less ready to do so, preferring to peacefully stay in tune. Joe Strummer alternatively condemned violence from the stage and got in fights with punters, and in an NME interview obliquely ruminated on creative violence while toying with a switchblade. The apolitical and reasonably non-violent drummer Terry Chimes, however, was ready to move on. To Bernie's dismay, he left the Clash and the increasing politics and sometimes violence that was surrounding the scene and the band. I was uncomfortable with the constant hardening up. I found it unnecessary and wearing. I thought, I'm not very happy. What's the point of being in this band if I'm not happy? It was the next phase. The band stenciled reggae lyrics and vaguely political slogans on their stage wear and placed an ad for a new drummer in Melody Maker magazine. Rob Harper, a friend of Billy Idol, began rehearsing with them as drummer in advance of a national tour with the Pistols. Harper couldn't stand Paul Simonon, which is a bad recipe for the rhythm section. The Sex Pistols Anarchy Tour was slated to start on December 3rd, 1976. It had the Clash at the bottom of the bill under Johnny Thunder's Heartbreakers and the Damned. Just before the tour, the Sex Pistols were booked last minute for a legendary and incendiary TV interview with Bill Grundy.
Nothing, a rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
The following days, Filth and Fury headline led to 14 of the 21 dates on the Anarchy Tour being cancelled, many of them at the last minute, as the groups crisscrossed the country. What remained of the tour was a travesty. Their one-time hero, Johnny Thunders, was using heroin constantly and was a mess. The Damned threatened to perform without the Pistols at a cancelled gig, and they were thrown off the tour. Bernie Rhodes and Malcolm discussed switching the bass player for the Sex Pistols and the Clash, an idea that went nowhere when Paul Simonon simply didn't show up for the meeting to discuss it. The tour was ruinous financially for both Bernie Rhodes and Malcolm McLaren and the bands. The buses returned to London on December 23rd. Rob Harper was done. Clash were low on cash and once again without a drummer, and it seemed like all the other bands were releasing records, but not the Clash. Yet. On New Year's Day, 1977, the Clash played a show at the Roxy. It was a new club, specifically geared to punk rock, and it would be Rob Harper's last show drumming with the Clash. It would also be the Clash's last show for 3 months. Don Letts was resident DJ at the Roxy, and he played a lot of reggae and dub music. Don also worked at Acme Attractions, which was sort of competition to Malcolm McLaren's punk boutique shops. He sold weed out of the shop to figures like Bob Marley, and provided reggae mixtapes to the likes of Patti Smith, John Lydon, and Debbie Harry. He became friends with the Sex Pistols and the Clash. People have the misconception that I turned all the punks onto reggae. That's not the case. Punks like Paul Simonon, Joe Strummer, and John Lydon were definitely well into reggae before I came along. The Clash were looking for something new, and playing reggae was something they began to consider. Joe had played Desmond Decker's Israelites with the 101ers, and he was a reggae fan, so he wasn't entirely new to the idea. But up until now, the Clash had resisted it. We had a saying about reggae: dig it, don't play it. But Joe Strummer was intrigued. He saw the potential to combine the sounds and some messages in reggae music with what they'd been doing, and to elevate the Clash's music to something new and effective. The Clash didn't do this lightly. They knew they were white, former art school students, but they weren't thoughtlessly appropriating the music. Band members had some authentic connections to the community, and punk and reggae were both forms of political protest music. They started work on 2 reggae covers, Dancing Shoes by Bob Marley and Police and Thieves by Junior Murvin. Polydor was courting the Clash for a record deal, one they desperately needed and wanted. Polydor was offering a £40,000 advance, but the morning they were going to sign, Bernie Rhodes announced the CBS would advance them up to £100,000 for a contract including international distribution. The band agreed, and in late January '77, CBS sent a grumpy executive from New York to sign them. When the CBS press officer offered them free records from the CBS back catalog, Mick Jones ordered all 19 of Dylan's records. Rhodes shrewdly purchased a music publishing company called Ninden to administer their music publishing royalties. This allowed the band to retain the rights to their music, which would prove crucial moving forward. Some on the scene considered it a sellout, but the Clash not only retained their rights, but also complete creative control of their work. A month after they inked the deal, the Clash delivered their first self-titled record. They'd been recording demos for it before they even signed, actually. Terry Chimes was asked back to fill in on drums. The demos were recorded at the National Film and Television School's 8-track music studio in Beaconsfield. In an effort to recapture their live sound, they enlisted Mickey Foote to produce it. Joe Strummer was the group's leader, but Mick Jones was the most musical of the lot, and he served as the musical director of sorts. Foote's recordings were good enough that CBS kept him on as producer for the record, which they completed at CBS Studios on Whitfield Street in London. 21-year-old Simon Humphrey was the CBS engineer on the project. They refused to shake my hand because I was a hippie. Joe Strummer didn't want anyone else there when he recorded his vocals. He'd sing with his mic up against the wall and play guitar at the same time because he couldn't divorce the two. Mick Jones was the one running the show. He was the one teaching Paul how to play bass. Paul was the moodiest with the most attitude. I didn't even talk to him. He was really scary. He had the notes painted on his bass. Since they disappointingly could not record at Rehearsal Rehearsals, Mickey Foote's goal was to capture that sound as much as possible. This meant trying to keep CBS from making it too clean or too perfect, and ruining it. Most of Joe Strummer's guide vocals were used on the album, but his guitar sounded so bad that it was not used on the record. Joe refused to put a sound baffle between the drums and the guitar, seemingly just to be difficult for the CBS engineer. Bernie Rhodes was butting in and making strange suggestions on how to record, pretending knowledge of recording that he did not have. He was alternately told to piss off or mocked by Mick and Joe. They did try some crazy ideas like throwing sheet metal down the studio stairs and recording it, or firing an air pistol into a wall. Those sounds were not used, though some canned sound effects were included in White Riot. They basically played their set and we recorded it. The CBS art department designed the sleeve with input from Paul and Bernie. The resulting sleeve's graphic elements would be influential to the album art of the punk era. Coney Grimes, despite his apolitical stance, was renamed Tory Crimes for the album cover notes. He was gone from the band by then, so he was not pictured on the album cover. The album was critically acclaimed at the time, successfully executing the band's vision, and The Clash remains potent and exciting today. I like the first album best, actually. The Clash still needed a permanent drummer. In spring of 1977, they auditioned a bunch of drummers, including John Moss, who would later play with Culture Club. Moss was offered the gig, but he was so annoyed by Bernie Rhodes' constant tirades that he backed out. In March, Mick ran into Nick Headon at a Kinks show. Headon had played with London SS until he left to play with a soul group. He was a versatile and capable drummer, and so Mick invited him to visit Rehearsal Rehearsals the following day to see what the Clash were doing. Nick was intelligent and skilled enough to see what the Clash were doing and to embrace what they needed in a drummer. He leaned into playing hard and fast. He was hired at the same rate as the rest of the band, £25 per week, given a haircut and a dye job, and outfitted in punk clothing fitting the Clash image. Paul named him Topper, after the character in the Tip Topper comics. Apparently, there was a resemblance. Like his predecessor, Topper wasn't totally thrilled with the violent edge and didn't totally jive with the band on a personal level, but he stuck with it. After a couple weeks rehearsing the material with Topper, they were ready to tour. After a warm-up gig in France, the first date on the White Riot tour was May 1st, 1977. The show was at Guildford Civic Hall, with Subway Sect supporting. The record was blowing up and the place was packed. The band was fully embracing and performing incredible sets and doing lots of speed, some say. The show at the Rainbow Room in London was easily the biggest crowd they'd ever played in front of. Punk was on the main stage now, but it was still wild and violent. The crowd enthusiastically trashed the place and threw junk at the band. Paul Simonon's father was there, watching from the back of the auditorium. While the band was on tour, CBS released the single for Remote Control without the band's input or say-so. So much for creative control. The band was enraged, and the label seemed to not even understand why they objected. In May, the tour ended. It was about a year since they had formed. Their first proper tour was a raging success, and their first record was in the top 20. But CBS hesitated to release it in the US, saying it wasn't commercially viable. When it became the #1 import in the States, CBS finally relented and released it, albeit with a different track listing. One night in summer of 1977, Joe came over to Mick's grandmother's flat with a sheet of paper. On it were the lyrics to a new song about being in the Clash, and with struggles with CBS over control. The title was Complete Control, inspired by one of Bernie Rhodes' diatribes in a club. They went upstairs with an acoustic and wrote the song in one evening. Bernie negotiated the single's release with CBS, independent of an album. The Clash would tour in support of it. They wanted the legendary producer Lee Scratch Perry to produce. He was one of the original producers of Junior Murvin's Police and Thieves. They met with him at Island Records, and he expressed his strong support of what they were doing. He told them Bob Marley was also aware of them and was writing a song that referred to them. It was called Punky Reggae Party. The band booked Sarm East Studio and settled in to record a few new tracks with Lee Perry. This is where Queen had recorded Bohemian Rhapsody, as well as sessions with Bob Marley, Yes, Madonna, Stevie Wonder, INXS, Elton John, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and more. The Clash recorded Complete Control and also The Prisoner, White Man in Hammersmith Palais, and the cover of Pressure Drop by the Maytals. Paul got the flu and had to leave when his bass parts were done, so he was crushed to miss the opportunity to hang out with one of his idols from the reggae world. Perry also did a dub mix of Complete Control, which had extreme low end and delay. The band loved it, but decided it was too inaccessible for many listeners, so Mickey Foote adjusted the mix to make it a little less extreme. To support the tour, the band set out on the Out of Control tour, which started in Europe and the UK, but the band was miserable. They were still only getting £25 a week, and they were eating poorly, if at all. They were kicked out of a hotel in Germany. When back in England, they just had a few days off. And on October 16th, they visited the Roundhouse to see the Vibrators, 999, and Radiators from Space. There at the bar, Mick and Joe met two young performers from Essex. Billy Bragg, and Wiggy Wiggs. The band's October 20th date in Belfast was postponed when the promoters couldn't get insurance for it. The band used the opportunity of being in a literal war zone to do an edgy photo shoot with some soldiers at a checkpoint. The move would look terrible in retrospect. The band members were somewhat clueless about what they were dealing with, and this would come back to haunt them later. As the tour continued, it was evident that things had changed. Punk was mainstream. It was talked about everywhere and shows were getting bigger. The expectation of young punks was violence. They often obliged, and every show seemed to inspire some act of violence. The press eagerly jumped on every event they could call a riot, every time a performer spat. The Clash support bands were pelted with bottles. At one show, a spitting fan hit Joe Strummer in the face. Topper shot up a hotel room with an air pistol. It was chaotic. Bernie was now talking to CBS about the Clash's second album. After a rough first record, they wanted a more established name producer to work with them. Guy Stevens and Lee Scratch Perry didn't seem like good fits. Mick and Joe somehow got John Lennon's phone number and were itching to ask him to produce, but in the end they never got up the courage to make the phone call. CBS tapped Blue Oyster Cult producer Sandy Pearlman as a possible producer. When Pearlman visited London to see some of the CBS artists' roster, he went to a Clash show. The band was expecting him, and when Joe Strummer realized Pearlman was in the audience, he made a dedication from the stage as the crowd booed. "We'd like to dedicate this next song to Ted Nugent, Aerosmith, Journey, and most of all to Blue Oyster Cult," and the band launched into I'm So Bored with the USA. After I saw that, I was ready to do the project. Sandy Pearlman went backstage to meet the band. A few days later, they met up with Pearlman again at CBS offices. They told him they loved the sound of Don't Fear the Reaper and Godzilla by Blue Oyster Cult. They'd found their new producer. Bernie Rhodes convinced CBS Records to float the Clash funds for a trip to Jamaica to explore the culture, music, and to get a real sense of the life of poverty and strife on the island. For some reason, only Mick and Joe went, to the disappointment of Paul, who was a massive reggae fan. Amazingly, they were able to score grass when they arrived and were not ripped off, but soon they realized locals were shouting white pigs at them. After trying unsuccessfully to find Lee Perry's Black Ark Studios, they holed up in the hotel for the rest of the trip, hearing gunshots outside periodically. They wrote music and only left the hotel to go to a nearby movie theater. Songs written in Jamaica were Tommy Gun, Last Gang in Town, and Safe European Home, all of which would end up on their second record. Meanwhile, a disillusioned Paul and his girlfriend, music journo Caroline Kuhn, went on a bargain trip to Russia. It was freezing, so they visited the museums. They had amazing museums in Moscow, but the city was dilapidated. Things had not been tended to, and it was quite grim and falling apart. I brought back some posters and the red stars, which became an important element in the Clash image. Topper stayed home and did absolutely nothing. When Paul came back from Russia, he found the band had been rehearsing, and Mick had already done scratch tracks of the bass lines. While Topper picked up the drum parts and added to them, Paul was taught his bass line and was upstairs trying to play them like a kid behind on his homework. The Clash band members insist that throughout this time they lived in relative poverty, with Bernie holding the purse strings tightly, even though they had a top 20 record. In December of '77, Mick Jones demanded funds to move out of his grandmother's flat and into his own. Bernie complied, and Mick moved in with Tony James into a 2-bedroom flat at Pembridge Villas. His roommate was now playing in Generation X, and they split the rent, £25 apiece each month. Johnny Green was their former tour driver, trusted roadie, and sort of a valet at the time, speaking truth to the band in rehearsals and simultaneously coddling them. Joe confided in him about his family history. Mick took tea at 4 and Johnny obliged. Mick got into coke and Johnny would serve him. Mick was moody. I'd go to his place around midday and make him his drink. It was a bit like the court of Louis XIV. He might have a girl there, he had a few regulars. I chopped him out of line. It was a slow process to get him going. It was all done very carefully, the idea being to keep him in a good mood. My technique was to get him up in a very soft, customer-friendly way. Mick and Tony had parties at the flat all the time. It was a gathering place. Mick got an early VCR before they were commonly available, and a copy of the movie Zulu. So Zulu was often playing on repeat in the background of these parties. They also, of course, listened to plenty of records, many of them reggae and dub. One night, Mick got the test pressing of the new single Clash City Rockers. Excitedly, he put it on the turntable at the party. What he heard outraged him. It had been a challenging song to record, and the band had done multiple takes trying to find the right tempo. On the playback, it was evident that the song had been sped up in post-production. Mick had wanted to re-record the song. Bernie said no, they had a deadline. It was 4 months since Complete Control came out. Bernie was trying to deliver the goods to CBS. As producer, Mickey Foote was the middleman between the band, Bernie, and CBS. He was trying to meet the needs of the situation, so he made a production decision. So when Mick heard this altered version of this song being planned for the single, he considered it a serious breach of trust. It came to light that Mickey Foote, their longtime friend and producer, was the culprit. He was fired. Mick Jones sucked it up, but he wasn't happy. In March of 1978, the sped-up single of Clash City Rockers was released. It's worth noting that on subsequent compilations and releases of the song, the original non-Verispeed version is used. During this period, the Clash declined to mime playing on Top of the Pops because they refused to lip-sync and mime playing songs. Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon gave a few interviews to the press on Bridges TV and in Cream magazine. They sometimes awkwardly discussed politics. Even approaching these topics was unusual for pop stars in those days. Paul and Joe didn't always express themselves well. But, despite the stumbles, a common thread began to emerge. Their moral vision seemed to be clearing. We're anti-fascist, we're anti-violence, we're anti-racist, and we're pro-creative, and we're against ignorance. Yet this message was still often at odds with what went on backstage. In January of 1978, their new established producer Sandy Pearlman returned to the UK to do a demo with the band for their new record. He actually got punched in the mouth by Robin Banks when he showed up at a show and tried to just walk backstage. Banks was working the door and was told not to let anyone in, so he jumped the band's producer the moment he came through the door. Luckily, Pearlman took it in stride. The band found it hilarious, and it became the stuff of rock and roll myth. The Clash beat up their own producer. The Clash wanted to get this gang of hard men around them. They were quite happy to be violent towards people who can't fight back, like producers. It was quite heartbreaking to see the way they behaved toward the people who worked for them. The sessions were interrupted when Joe fell ill. It was hepatitis, and it was serious. Strummer denies that he ever tried heroin. He blames the disease on that fan spitting in his face on tour. He was seriously ill, and the band was on hiatus for the rest of January and February.